Okay, so here's the second video. All right, so just to remind everybody where we've got to so far. So far, we've said that what we're interested in is an analysis of the concept of being an antique. I've said that I don't think that antiques need to be old. I haven't said why yet. And what I've done is just said, look, we can distinguish between two types of concept: a strict concept and a family resemblance concept. A strict concept is where you can give a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for being an antique or being a thing of that kind. And then I've given Rosenstein's um, what he thinks an antique is, and said that he thinks, in fact, it's not possible to give a necessary and sufficient conditions. You can only give, the concept is a family resemblance concept, and you can only give a cluster of conditions that a thing must have in order to be an antique. But he does think that technical perfection, age, and subject are all necessary parts of the cluster, and all the rest of these. All right, so that's what Rosenstein says. And I said this is where my account comes in. So, I wrote this with this guy, Darren Baines. You've got the article available in now. So, this is where we come in. I think it is possible to give necessary and sufficient conditions for being an antique. So I provide a definition in the article, or we provide. I'll keep saying in terms of I, but it should be we, really. I give a definition as follows. So this is what I think, how you correctly give a definition of an antique. Oh, I've got down there manuscript. I forgot to update this. So this is published in 2016. So ANT, an object X of an artifactual kind K is an antique K if and only if X exemplifies technical excellence for a K and was made in a style and using a method of production for making Ks that subsequently became obsolete but is exemplary of and so rooted in the era and place in which the K was made. So I'm going to spell all that out and explain what that means, but I think that gives an account of what it is to be an antique. The first thing that I want to point out is this idea that I'm saying an object X of an artifactual kind K is an antique K if and only if. So what's this all about, this idea of an artifactual kind K? Why don't I just say an object X is an antique if and only if? Why has it got this form, an object X of an artifactual kind K? So I'll talk about that first of all. Hang on, I should say. Yeah, okay, I'll come to that. I'll come to the K thing in a minute. I've meant to say this first. First is, look, actually, I've got some agreement with Rosenstein. I think that what he says about technical perfection and age are, in fact, more or less right. And in fact, it's enough to define what an antique is, although, as we'll see, age isn't quite as Rosenstein understands it to be. So we'll come to that in a minute anyway. So let's say I don't reject everything that Rosenstein says, but I reject a fair bit of it, and I've got my own account. So all right then, all antiques are Ks or kinds. So now we've got to understand now, first of all, a kind of thing. So a kind of object is like, here are some examples: a chair, a table, a cat, a curry, a person. So a kind is a kind term is something that carries what are called identity conditions with it. You see, here is a point where I was going to ask me questions about it, but I'll try and say a little bit about it. So a kind is something that you can track over time and space. So, you can say this chair is the same as that chair. So a chair at time t1 is identical with a chair at time t2. Tables, they're all things which you can identify and point to their boundaries and trace them across time and space, right? That's what a kind is. That's what it carries identity conditions along with it. Now, some concepts are not kind concepts at all. So take, and I've given the example down here, the notion of being red. So being a red thing doesn't carry with it any identity conditions whatsoever. It's adjectival, as I put it. That is to say, there's no such thing as a red, right? You can't say, what is a red? Is that a red over there? There's no such thing as being a red. Rather, what you can have is a red thing of a particular kind. So you can have a red chair, a red table, a red cat, and so on. Right? So the concept of being red is not a kind concept. It's an adjectival concept, and it applies to a thing of a kind. That's the idea. And the thought here is being an antique is not itself a kind concept. So there's no such kind of thing as an antique. We do often say, oh, this is an antique, but that's because it's fairly clear that, you know, it's an antique of a particular kind. So you can have an antique chair, an antique table, and so on. You can't have an antique cat, I don't think. I'll talk about why. But right, it's an adjectival concept. It's not like the concept of being a chair or being a table. It's something that applies to things that are kinds. I hope that makes sense. So the concept of an antique is the same, or the same in this respect to the concept of being red. It applies to a type of thing and doesn't itself pick out a type or kind of thing. All right, that's the first observation. Notice that a red desk isn't a different kind of object from a blue desk. They're both desks, okay? A red desk is a different kind of thing from a red wardrobe. One's a desk and the other's a wardrobe, even though they share, you know, they're both red, but they're a different kind of thing. So there's a similar thing to say about antiques here. An antique desk isn't a different kind of object from a modern IKEA desk. They're both desks. One's an antique, one isn't. And an antique desk is a different kind of object from an antique wardrobe. So even though they're both antiques, it doesn't mean they're both of the same kind. One's a desk, one's a wardrobe, even though they're both antiques. Okay. So this is just to emphasize this notion that antique is not a kind concept, but an adjectival concept. So my claim is when we are asking what's the concept of an antique, or give an analysis of it, what we want to know is under what conditions does an object of a particular kind, what conditions must it meet in order to be an antique of that kind, right? So, you know, that's how I put an object X of an artifactual kind K. So under what conditions, you can put it like this, under what conditions is a table, an antique table? Under what conditions is a chair, an antique chair, a vase, an antique vase, and so on and so forth, right? So that's why this bit says an object X of an artifactual kind K is an antique K if and only if. So we're presupposing that we've already got something of a particular kind, and then what we want to know is under what conditions is that kind of thing an antique kind. So as I've said, yeah. So that's the idea. That's why the first bit of the definition is put in that way. Rosenstein himself doesn't seem to notice this. He doesn't seem to realize that it's an adjectival concept. So it's the first kind of a disagreement, I suppose, with Rosenstein, but it seems clearly true to me. One last thing about this. I've put artifactual kind in here, and this is because I think, in fact, only certain types of thing can be antiques. I'm unsure how to spell out exactly why this is, but I don't think, for example, it's got to be an artifactual kind. It's got to be a man-made thing. An artifact is like a man-made thing. I don't think you can have an antique rock. I don't think you can have an antique person. I don't think you can have an antique cat, or right. These sorts of things are not the right kinds of thing to be antiques. Antiques must be man-made artifacts, in my view. So it's almost like we've got a restriction on what kinds of things can be antiques right from the outset. But I just think that's true. I'm willing for people to disagree with me, and in fact, somebody last year has disagreed with me on this, and they think that, you know, natural things like you can have an antique carrot or an antique piece of broccoli or something. I don't think that's right, but anyway, I'm open to discussion and argument about that. But on my view, it's only man-made things, artifacts, that can be antiques. So that's why the first bit of the definition is written as it is. All right. Yeah, so a desk is an antique desk, an example. All right, so that gives, so I'll just go back just briefly to show you again the definition. Oh dear, it seems to have crashed. Let's go back like this. We'll have to wait for this to load up. I won't stop the recording. I'll just hope that it resolves itself. So what we're now going to go on to do, at any rate, is we're going to consider what Rosenstein says about the actual conditions for being an antique. So what I can start to talk about is technical perfection. He talks about the idea that antiques have got to be technically perfect. That is to say, he thinks that. So you can see. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll come to it now. It's back up. So I wanted to go back to this definition and say, look, so far what I've done is explain the first bit of this definition. Why do I say an object X of an artifactual kind K is an antique K? And the reason why the form of it is like that is because I think the concept of antique is an adjectival concept, not a kind concept, and it applies to kind. So that's just explain that bit. So I'm now going to move on to this idea of it exemplifying, as I've put it, technical excellence, right? And as Rosenstein has it, it should be technical perfection. I just think that although he's broadly right, that's a bit strong. So we'll come to that in a sec. Let's move through to it. Okay, so here's what Rosenstein says. He says, technical perfection involves many elements. On the one hand, it concerns the question of how, by what processes, the material medium has been formed, designed, and whether or not the choice of materials in a given instance and the manner of conforming them to the design best embody the idea of the work. We also ask conversely, does the idea best bring out the characteristics of the material? This aspect often is referred to as truth to materials, which sometimes mean allowing the materials the upper hand, giving them leeway to do what they most naturally do, as when wood is left to show its grain. Anyway, I won't read the rest of that. But he says here, you can see here that the idea of technical perfection, as he says down here, is the cause of the experience that can only be captured by imagining that the work is presenting itself to us. He's saying, voila. So he's got this idea that in order for something to be an antique, it's got to be technically perfect. It's got to be made from the right materials in the right kind of a way and so on. And I just think, well, I just don't really agree with the idea of technical perfection. I think that to be an antique, it's got to have an object has got to have a certain quality to it. And in fact, we'll see that's why, to a large degree, I don't think an IKEA desk could ever be an antique, despite the fact that they are well designed. I don't deny that, and they are, clever the way that they flat pack them and so on. But they haven't really got the level of quality that's needed in order for something to be a genuine antique. So, a mass-produced desk, I don't think, can ever be an antique because it doesn't have that level of technical excellence. But I don't think you need to go as far as technical perfection. I don't think you need to say that something has to be absolutely perfect in order for it to be a candidate for being an antique. A slight error perhaps in one of the joins of a thing doesn't necessarily mean that debars it from being an antique just because it's not absolutely perfect. So I just want to change that really to, right, X exemplifies technical excellence. So I agree that certain level of quality is needed. I agree with Rosenstein on this, but I just don't think it has to be perfection. Okay. Right, so there's the first condition. All right. An object X of an artifactual kind K is an antique K if and only if it exemplifies technical excellence. So nothing can be an antique unless it's got a certain level of technical excellence, which is to do with making it from the right materials, constructed in the right way, and so on. But much in agreement with Rosenstein. Now, let's consider age. Now, as I've said, this is probably the most obvious condition to apply to antiques. Antiques must be old. But there's a question, how old do they have to be then? If it is true that antiques have to be old, how old do they have to be? One thing that's often cited is that something has to be 100 years old to be an antique, right? So that's to say, look, an object X of an artifactual kind K is an antique K if and only if, and one of the conditions on there, it would be here, the proposed condition would be X is 100 years old. I don't think this is right. The idea that something has to be 100 years old in order to be an antique was in fact introduced arbitrarily in the United States in 1930 by this thing called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. And it was meant to, you won't go into the details of this, but it was intended to basically, it was intended to get money or to allow antique dealers to move antique furniture in and out of the country without gaining tax. So it's a long story, but America at that time wanted to try to prevent. They wanted new furniture to be made in the country for reasons to do with the economy, and they put this import and export tax on new furniture being imported and exported out of the country. But they didn't want to stop the antique trade, so they just arbitrarily picked 100 years and just said, well, okay, look, for the sake of this act, we'll say anything over the 100 years old is exempt from the tax. So this 100-year rule was it was done for pragmatic reasons to do with taxation and nothing to do with the concept of an antique itself. And in fact, it's not abided by in the trade. There are lots of examples of things which are fewer than 100 years old in the antique trade, that is, antique dealers and at auction houses, that have got nothing at all to do with being 100 years old. These are Cartier bracelets, for example. They're often traded in antiques houses. They were made in the 1920s, 1930s, but they've been considered antiques for many, many years. So, at one time these were 60 years old and considered antiques. Another example is Edwardian furniture. We had some Edwardian furniture earlier. Edwardian furniture was made in the early 1900s, but have been considered antiques for a long time. So, again, 50, 60, 70 years old, they still counted as antiques. So they're still quite old, right? They haven't been considered antiques since they were made, so there is a certain age to them. So you might still be thinking here, well, okay, Ben, maybe they don't have to be 100 years old, but they've still got to be a certain age, right? I'm not so sure. So I think it's arguable that things like this is a Danish teak sideboard made in the 1970s. And these, I think, are plausibly antiques. They're certainly traded for high prices in the auction houses. So I think that plausibly these things count as antiques even now, even though they're only made in the 70s. You might still say, well, look, they're still in the 70s, and that's what, 80s, 90s, 2000. It's still 50 years old, so it's still got a certain age to it. All right. Well, let's turn to what Rosenstein says about age, and then I'll introduce my idea about it. Rosenstein says this. He says, age is better understood as agedness. This historical characteristic means that it clearly is made in a style that is no longer current, and that it clearly shows material signs of aging, but especially that it speaks for its age. That is, it is sufficiently exemplary of its past era to provoke for us an image of that world now gone. Now, again, I agree with much of what Rosenstein says here, but I don't agree with all of it. So, okay, let's pick out. I agree with this bit. I think that age is to do with the idea about being made in a style that is no longer current, or at least that we need to slightly change that, I think, to get the right idea. So the reason why I think you can't have it being made in a style that is no longer current. So think about the example of the Edwardian furniture we just saw. Those now nobody. Well, that style of furniture is no longer made. Things aren't really made in that way, and right. So I don't want to go back to it because it froze up last time I tried to go back. But I'll give some examples later. Think about some old piece of furniture and think about the style in which it's made, and recognize that there are lots of furniture nowadays isn't made in that style, right? So I agree that there is something to do with that. We can't, though, say it's made in a style that's no longer current because style revivals are come about often. Sometimes people start making furniture in old styles again, and that wouldn't be enough to rule out the old piece of furniture as being an antique. So what we need to say is made in a style that subsequently became obsolete, that kind of went out of style, even if it has come back, so long as it went out of this style, right, it gets to count as an antique. I'll say a bit more about this in a minute. So I put in like this. An object X of an artifactual kind K is an antique K if and only if. So the first condition was that it exemplifies technical excellence. The second condition is X was made in a style and using a method of production that subsequently became obsolete. So I also think that this idea of a method of production is important here. So the thought is, so take an Edwardian piece of furniture, the style that it has become obsolete. Nobody makes furniture in that style nowadays, or few people do. So it's kind of obsolete in the sense it's not a widespread style. But also the method of production used is important. So it would have been made using techniques in that period which are no longer used today, right? I think that's the key thing about age. So notice, by the way, that in 2 here, the notion of having a particular age, i.e. a number of years or something like that, isn't mentioned. All that's mentioned is that X was made in a style and using a method of production that subsequently became obsolete. That's going to be important. And that's why I think it's not analytic that antiques must be old. I'll come back to that. But you get the idea, right? So, now moving on to the one thing which I think is the second thing that Rosenstein says about age, and this I think is wrong. So he says, clearly shows material signs of aging. I just think that's false. So, look, that a antique object shows material signs of aging, I don't think that's got anything to do with making it an antique. So to give a counter example, imagine that you've got something that is an antique chair, or that clearly is an antique, and it might show material signs of aging. But suppose that when that thing was made, suppose in the 1700s, it was put into a vacuum chamber and just left in there so that it didn't age, right? So a vacuum chamber has got no air, no oxygen in it, and that effectively stops things from getting old. So you could have had something made in 1700, technically excellent, made with good materials, in the style and method of production of the time, so certainly an antique, but that doesn't show any material signs of aging. Therefore, showing material signs of aging it's irrelevant and doesn't matter, right? So I want to reject that aspect of this. Okay, so I stick with that. So we've so far then got an explanation of why I say you've got to give the definition in terms of artifactual kinds. That's because the notion of an antique is not a kind concept, but an adjectival one, as I say. I've explained why I think it must exemplify technical excellence. And I've half agreed, I suppose, with Rosenstein that what's important is that an antique was made in a style and using a method of production that subsequently became obsolete. And I've emphasised that it's not just the style that matters, but the method of production. Okay, I'm going to say a bit more about that in due course. Now, well, here we go. And then the final bit of it says, it's exemplary of and so rooted in the era and place in which the K was made. What do I mean by that? Well, go back to condition 2 and you think, well, okay, suppose that we've got a piece of furniture that, say we've got some kind of a cabinet maker or somebody who makes pieces of furniture, and suppose that they decide that they're going to make a chair or a table or something, and they're going to make it in an old style, and they are in fact going to use the same method of production that was used, say, 400 years ago. So they use old tools. They don't use any modern tools or anything like that. So then you would have a newly made object that may very well, a newly made table, let's say, that exemplifies technical excellence, and it was made in a style and using the method of production that has become obsolete, but it was made yesterday. I want to say that's still not enough to make the thing an antique, because it's not exemplary of the era and place in which the K was made. So this idea of being rooted in the era, I just think that they're making it, you copying the old style and not So there's something about the idea that people that an antique must be made using the method of production. That method of production was learned in the era itself, right? So take some sort of an antique table, and it's like the cabinet maker who made that antique table wasn't copying any methods that used to be used. He was embedded within that era. He learned the methods and the techniques and the style and the method of production within that past era. And therefore, the thing that he makes is exemplary of, and I say rooted in that era. Whereas if somebody used that method nowadays, and that method of production made something in that style, they would not be rooted in that era, and so the thing would not count as a genuine antique. I hope that makes some sense. Let me know. I mean, again, right, this is exactly the kind of a point where I'd like to get feedback from the audience. I'd like to ask questions and see whether people have understood. And I can't get that kind of feedback in a video. But I hope you've understood the idea. Please do let me know in comments whether you agree with this, or, I'm open to people to disagree. And so, okay. All right. So there's a sense in which, right, I do agree with this. It evokes in us an image of the world. I mean, I don't really agree that it must evoke in us an image of the world now gone, but it must, in some sense, come from that era, i.e., be made using those methods and production that were invented in that era. Look, maybe this will help to explain what I mean. Let's give a few of the different styles and methods of production. So here's a Jacobean piece. So Jacobean just means it was made in the era of James I, and there are the years given there, 1603 to 1625. Right, so they used a lot of oak in this period, and they used a lot of heavy carving. So this is an example of a bench made then, and you can see here that they use these turned. Yeah, so it's very distinctive. Lots of kind of square edges, heavy, dark oak furniture with heavy carving. And that's a very, very typical of that era. So you can imagine the people who were making them in that era, this was the style and method of production that was used then. And that fell out of that people stopped making furniture in that way. Or, the general way of making it, methods of production changed. And if anybody were now to make something like this using those old methods of production, they would be kind of doing it inauthentically. They would be copying the styles. They wouldn't have learned them rooted within the era itself. So I think that's the key thing. Why does this count as an antique? Well, look, because it's got a certain quality to it. It's made from good materials using some method of production. It's made in a particular style and using a method of production that became obsolete. People stopped making things generally in this way, and the methods and techniques that were learned in that era, and therefore, because that has now become obsolete and stopped being made in that way, that's what makes this an antique. And we can see the shift in style. So I'll give another example. Here's an early Georgian. Look at the difference between the Jacobean and the Georgian era. So 100 odd years later, different type of wood. This is walnut. You notice you've got these swan legs on here, so there's more curves coming in. It's more kind of, you see these curves down here, less blocky, more, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's not as sort of heavy and sort of, it's got a more elegance to it. And this is typical of the Georgian period. And again, right, the methods of production that they use, so the brass on there. Notice there's no brass on here. They started using brass for the drawer handles, and it's very clearly a particular style and method of production used there. Have a look at this Victorian era. Now, this is actually what's called a Gothic revival thing. So in the Victorian era, people started to make things that kind of were similar to the early Jacobean period, but that involved some slight differences. So notice at the top of here, you've got these Gothic arches, right? You're using oak again, and it's kind of heavy. But I won't go into the detail, but there's definite differences between the way in which these are made and the Jacobean style. And, if you know about this, you can spot them and tell the differences. So again, you've got, even though this is a kind of revival of an old way of making things, it had its own differences and its own method and style of production and their particular techniques. Okay, so they're just some examples. So I say, look, what is it to be rooted in an era? It's partly to do with the styles and method of production, but as I've been trying to get across, it's that those styles and methods of production have been applied authentically. That is to say, that they've been learned and applied in the era where those methods and styles of production were invented. It's not enough to do it nowadays. It would be copying. Right. So that's it. I think that's what I've given you my full definition of what it is to be an antique. So Rosenstein gives a bunch of other things which he thinks go into the cluster. I think that those are irrelevant. I think we've given enough to define what an antique is already. So I now need to reject the other conditions that Rosenstein gives. Right, so I'll go on to do that. So here I'm going to reject some of the other conditions that Rosenstein gives. Provenance. Well, what's provenance? Provenance is actually to do with how we know that something is an antique. So when things are sold at auction, to say that they've got provenance is to say that we know where they've come from. So if you've got like an old table or an antique table, it might be that you've got the original maker's certificate or the original receipt that when the thing was originally made in, say, 1700 or something like that. And then you've got some sort of a history of where that thing's been, so that the receipts of it being passed, and the provenance in effect is it verifies something as being an antique because it gives evidence of its history and where it was made. But Rosenstein somehow seems to think that provenance can make a difference to whether something is an antique or not. And I just think that's false. I think it's about whether we know something is an antique, not about whether it is one. So, you might have some sort of desk in front of you and not know whether it was made in the 1700s. You might not have a certificate or some sort of a original receipt. Very often you can tell by looking at the thing, but suppose you can't tell. Well, what that means is you're not sure whether it is an antique or not, but it doesn't make a difference to whether it is an antique or not. The question of whether it is an antique or not depends on where it was made, how it was made, the technical excellence, the conditions have already given. Whether or not you can actually know those things is, in my mind, irrelevant. So I reject that. Condition. Yeah, so Rosenstein thinks that something has got to be in a good condition to be an antique. Again, I think that's just false. I think you can have something that is clearly an antique but is in bad condition. I don't think that's got anything to do with whether an antique is an antique. What it does matter, so an antique that's in bad condition is not going to be worth as much in monetary value, right? So, a kind of antique desk which is all scratched and broken, it's like, well, it's still an antique desk. The fact that it's in bad condition doesn't stop it from being an antique desk. It might stop it from being worth as much as it would otherwise be worth, but that's got nothing to do whether it is an antique either. So I reject condition for that reason. Okay. Size. This is a weird one. Rosenstein thinks that something has got to be an appropriate kind of a size to be an antique, and I just don't understand it. He says this. He says a small nail from a 19th century chest of drawers, even apart from its failings with respect to the other categories, is not an antique. At best, he says, it's an antique fragment. Cities, or even portions of them, we would not refer to as antiques. And he suggests that that's got something to do with the size of them. Nails, he thinks, are too small to be antiques, and cities are too big. I don't think it's got anything to do with size. I just think that, in fact, it's to do with the kind of things they are. Nails and cities are just not the kinds of things that can be antiques. It's nothing to do with their size. It's to do with the kinds of thing they are. Like a nail is something that you would use. You can't have a nail that's a very good quality nail made using a style. It's just not the right kind of thing. And a city certainly isn't, because a city is made up of lots of different buildings which can come from lots of different periods in history. It's just not, you can't call it an antique city because cities aren't the right kinds of things to be antiques, right? Lest you think that I'm doing him down here, consider that Doll's house furniture is really, really small. But I think they can be antiques, right? Doll's house furniture can be as small as a nail, but still be an antique. And imagine, I mean, nobody would ever make such a thing, but imagine you made a massive, great big ceramic pot, right, the size of a city. Well, that'd be absolutely massive. It'd be really big, but I think it could still count as an antique. So I reject the idea that size has got anything to do with being an antique. All right, so I mean, if you want to see why I reject it, there's a few others. I reject the other ones for similar kinds of reasons. So I want to really just finish things up. So I've given you my defense or my account of what an antique is. I just want to talk through the consequences. So in particular, I said this, right? So here was the definition again. An object X of an artifactual kind K is an antique K, if and only if X exemplifies technical excellence and was made in a style and using a method of production for making Ks that subsequently became obsolete. And remember, that's got to be based upon authentic methods learned in that period. Now, as a matter of fact, styles and methods of production take a long time to change. So, because of the world that we live in, it takes 50 years, maybe longer sometimes, for styles and method productions to evolve over time. So think about, from the Jacobean period to the Georgian period, there were various different changes that went on. There were different types of tools invented, different methods were learned, and it takes a while for them to shift, right? So the styles and methods that are used to make things shift slowly over time. And it's that shift over time which makes a style and a method of production become obsolete. So we now make things using methods and styles which are different from the past, which is why the things made in the past using those old methods and styles, the things made in that way are antiques. And it takes a long time. But notice it's not a logical truth that methods of production, styles and methods, take a long time to change. We can imagine, well, I mean, it's difficult to imagine, but suppose we lived in a world where styles and method of production changed every day, right? It's not a matter of logic that styles and method of production take a long time to change. They could change quickly. And in a world where they change quickly, then I claim the concept of an antique would apply. Suppose that styles and method of production changed overnight. If that were true, if that could happen, then things made yesterday would be made in a style and using a method of production that subsequently became obsolete and were exemplary of the era in the place, right? And you could have something made yesterday that would count as an antique, I say. So the consequence of this is, as a matter of fact, because styles and method of production do take a long time to change, it means that all antiques are old, right? But it's not a logical truth, it's not an analytic truth that they're old, because it's just a contingent fact about the way the world is, that methods of production. So it's not, that's what I mean by it's not part of the concept of an antique that it's old. It's part of the concept of an antique that it was made in a style and method of production that's become obsolete. And as a matter of fact, those take a long time. So as a matter of fact, all antiques do turn out to be old, even though it's not part of the concept of an antique itself. So yes, that's my claim. So it's not analytic that antiques are old. All right. Now, I can't really do this properly. There is a final thing, and really, this is. I wanted to do this again in class, so I've got some really interesting. Well, I think they're interesting. Maybe you wouldn't think so. Kind of examples that I wanted to try out on you and ask you about time travel, Georgian offshoots, and twin Earth. There's all sorts of interesting things that we can say to test out the definition that I've given. But I need to, as it were, get feedback and responses and discuss them. So I'm not going to be able to do this in this video, but I'll give one example to try and to try and explain where this comes from. So, Georgian offshoots. Here's a thought. So the thought is this: imagine that we're in the Georgian period, so in the 1700s, and they're making furniture using a method and style of production for making furniture. And imagine that a bunch of Georgians go off on a ship. So people in the 1700s go off in a ship and they find an island and they set up an offshoot society on a little island. And suppose that we forget about the island and it remains isolated from the rest of the world and nobody visits it, and they're kind of they carry on their Georgian way of life on that island, with nobody interfering with them. You got the idea? So it's like we can imagine it's like a little time stops on this island, and they maintain their Georgian way of life. They build houses and furniture and all the rest, completely cut off from the rest of the world. On that island, then, they would be making furniture in the same way as furniture was made in the 1700s, and they would have. I propose that they would be making that furniture authentically using those methods and styles of production. So they're kind of learning them in the same societal and cultural background as was in Georgian England. So I claim that the furniture that they would be making would be antique furniture, even though it's made today. And I can't really give it because I'd like to get your feedback, as I said, and discuss this a bit more. But I think that's true. I think that if there was a Georgian offshoot, they would be making antique furniture even today, so it would be stuff that wasn't old. Okay, and then I had some more examples. Maybe, if anyone's interested, get in touch, and I'm happy to, maybe we can set up, if there are people who are interested in this, I'm happy to set up. So you've got a seminar with Ruth, but if you want to discuss it further with me, I'm happy to do so, and we can set up a little meeting if people are interested. So just let me know. Okay, so how long have we recorded there? Another 41 minutes. Yeah, so normally it's a little bit shorter than it would be were I given this in class. Not too much shorter with the 10-minute break in it. So 20, yeah, so you're talking about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Yeah, because I haven't got the feedback and the discussion. But okay, so there we go. That's the philosophy of antiques. And any comments? I'd be very willing to hear them. I hope that made sense and was at least of some interest. Thanks all.